This episode features Albena Azmanova and James Galbraith in a conversation about capitalism and our path forward. Albena was born in Bulgaria and became a dissident under the communist regime. Currently, she's a professor of social and political science at the University of Kent's Brussels School of International Studies. Her latest book, Capitalism on Edge: How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia, is the main topic of our discussion. James is an American economist and self-described dissident under the capitalist regime, and professor at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the Department of Government, University of Texas, Austin. He's also a senior scholar with the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College and part of the executive committee of the World Economics Association. Although Albena and James share the perspective that our state of capitalism is unsustainable, they differ in their proposed approaches to change the system. So I'm excited to start this conversation. Hi, Albena and James. Great to have you on.
Hello, Lucy. Good to be in conversation indeed.
Yeah.
Yep, likewise.
So James, let's get started. You argue that the signature of modern American capitalism is neither competition nor class struggle, nor an inclusive middle-class utopia. Instead, it's predation that has become the dominant feature of our system, and where the rich feast on the decaying institutions. And Albena, you argue that the dominant feature is the competitive pursuit of profit that defines this 21st century precarity capitalism. Would you say that whatever James described, the predation is the same thing as competitive pursuit of profit, or are the defining characteristics different?
No, I think these two features reinforce one another, exactly because precarity, or this massive, ubiquitous insecurity that the globalized and intensified rush for profit has generated for everybody. Now, I see the predation, or that the political and economic establishment is preying on democratic institutions as a sort of a reaction to that, as a safety reaction for those classes, that top layer, to save itself. The way drugs are the protection mechanism, the coping mechanism for some sectors of some sections of the population. So predation that James described is probably can be seen as the kind of coping mechanism of the affluent and the powerful. This is I'm improvising on the spot here. I haven't really thought about that, so thank you for asking it. And of course, now one factor now it comes to mind that allows predation to intensify, or even enabling conditions. So precarity can be seen as enabling condition because, as I note in my writing, it's precarity or this kind of deep insecurity linked to the insecurity of livelihoods is politically debilitating. So because people become more introvert, more focused on coping mechanisms, they cannot push back and fight, those processes that actually James describes in his work of predation.
So, yeah, let me perhaps just sort of clarify where I was coming from. Mm-hmm. In developing that particular argument. I wrote this book called The Predator State in 2000, I think it appeared in 2008. And it was a reaction to in particular, the climate of the Bush-Cheney administration. The subtitle of the book was how conservatives abandoned the free market and why liberals should too. So which got a certain number of guffaws from the press that saw the book. In any event, I come out of course, of an old tradition of of the development of the welfare state, not only in the United States but also in Europe. That was the project of my father's generation and of his contemporaries, and it happened in the wake of a vast crisis and effectively collapse of the previously existing capitalist system at the end of the 1920s. So what was built in the 30s and 40s and developed into the 50s and 60s and through the administration of Lyndon Johnson was a very large and very stable welfare state, with even in the United States, where many people of progressive bent tend to say, well, gee, we're not Sweden. I've never felt that we had that much. The Swedes had that much on us, frankly. The Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It is a system which is very ad hoc in important ways and has gaps and so forth. But frankly, it provided a vast amount of security that had never existed before in the capitalist world. So the defining feature of the politics of the early 2000s and even now, but especially in that particular moment, where it was the cutting edge was predatory on this system. So, for example, the effort to privatize Social Security, the efforts to the creation of a drug benefit in Medicare, which nevertheless was designed to greatly enrich the pharmaceutical companies. You could go on just listing these things, and this was what so-called conservative politics was largely about. It wasn't about creating free markets or going back to the 19th century. It was about making your clientele wealthy on the back of programs that had been built to stabilize the economy. The result of that certainly is a huge increase in the precarity of the population as a whole, because it undermines the stability of those programs, undermines their legitimacy. But that was essentially the argument I was making. The starting point should not be taken as one in which we are trying to provide basic welfare benefits and security to an otherwise free market system, but one in which those benefits had been very highly developed and were being steadily undermined in order basically to benefit a small number of, let's call them, I think the common term in certain parts of the world is oligarchs, and I'm happy to use that. We have a fair number of them around here.
Mm-hmm. So you touched upon the historical sort of evolution of capitalism, which started in the 19th century with the first phase called liberal capitalism, as you, Albena, described, which was characterized by belief in economic growth and competitive private enterprise, and where risks and opportunities were correlated, at least at the beginning. But then, workers started taking on more risk, and that led to the imbalance and transition to welfare capitalism, which was around World War II, after World War II, which was characterized by the social safety net, as James described. But a lot of the solutions that you both propose are similar to welfare capitalism, but welfare capitalism failed in the 70s because of this huge economic crisis, hyperinflation, and because the state intervention was preventing companies, the productive production of profit, and the regulation was preventing economic actors from doing their job. So why do you think that it failed, and what could have been done better?
At least in academic circles, the jury is still out of why the welfare the welfare state deal fell apart, because a lot of that was kind of an ideological push from the neoliberal perspective that this is the way to go. The infamous Tina logic. There is no alternative to free market, globalized capitalism. So that was rather an ideological dogma. But I don't think that it's worth sorting out the reasons for the failure of the welfare state. The issue is whether it is desirable to try to go back to that model. And what was good about that model was that it was a model of inclusive prosperity, right? There was less inequality, really a concerted effort at inclusion and social fairness, stability. So, but is it desirable to go back? Because we know the great cost of that. There was, two great costs of that model. Heavy bureaucratic state that was criticized even from the left. So kind of some sort of a bureaucratic autocracy was creeping in, and environmental degradation. So all that growth, we paid the price of destroying nature. So can we return there, and do we want to return there? That would be my challenge to recent fashion among the left, this nostalgia for the post-war welfare state.
But also, I think the war put everyone on a level playing field, right? In the 50s, everyone was starting from scratch pretty much. In America, building institutions, companies. And so it sort of went hand in hand. But if you look at the 21st century, we are nowhere near that.
Well, let me just again beg to differ a little bit here, because in the U.S., the creation of the modern state, the modern welfare state, the modern industrial state predates the Second World War by a good decade. You can date it to the start of the New Deal in 1933, or even a little bit before that in some respects. But that's where the big turning points occur, and the capacity of the United States to play the role that it did in the Second World War was built up in the 1930s. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened that way. So that just to begin with, it's a longer story. I don't think that it's fair to say that the welfare state was a particularly bureaucratic entity. Things like the Social Security Administration and Medicare actually run extremely efficiently. That is part of the problem that they have politically, is that the bureaucracies in the private insurance companies, that's where the big fat is. That's where the big payments are. That's where the complicated regulations are. It's not in the parts that are actually administered by the state, because universal insurance, unemployment insurance, health insurance, old age insurance, disability, these kinds of things, which are the crucial elements in preserving people from precarity, are really fairly efficiently administered on a universal basis. That's the problem. From their political point of view, is you can't make as much money off them as you can if you can cherry pick and classify people according to their risk factors and so forth, the way private insurance works. So that's one set of issues. Then let me come back to the question of what undermined this whole system in the late 60s, 1970s, and that I think there are a couple of things going on here. That one is that there was a huge tension. And this was at the beginning of my career, I was in the congressional staff at the time of the Carter administration, between the labor movement, which was part of the New Deal coalition, and the other major elements of the Democratic Party, which were basically professional, strongly influenced by mainstream economics, so that tension was very, very strong, and it opened up the moment in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when labor was effectively crushed. It was wiped out as a political force, and that happened because of essentially the reinsertion of the power of the financial sector. So the interest rates were raised, the world was plunged into a debt crisis, the dollar became the de facto currency of the world reserves of world trade, all of which had not really been the case up until the late 1970s.
The US dollar became a fiat currency.
when that happened, the system became extremely unbalanced, and you have what emerged at the end was it was an economy in the U.S. where you have a very prosperous East Coast that's based upon finance, insurance, real estate, a West Coast which has it's dominated by information technology, aerospace, and a vast interior, which large parts of which have been really in deep trouble and quite stagnant for a long period of time. So that's the in some sense a short take on the let's say the development events in the United States. And part of that's because inevitably over the period of the Cold War, the U.S. was fostering industrial development and recovery, first in Germany and Japan, and ultimately, China came in as part of the system as well. So, as a major partner, it was intended to isolate the USSR with consequences that nobody in the 1970s foresaw, but that are certainly very much shaping the world economy as we now see it.
Mm-hmm. Albena, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm just thinking that the movement, there was not a rapid collapse. It has been, at least in Europe, there has been a persistent erosion of the welfare state. We still have stronger unions as compared to the US in Europe. There's more residue of the welfare state, but it is going away. So what I observe is that contemporary capitalism actually has come to combine probably the worst feature of the welfare state. James would disagree with me, but let's say, the worst feature of the welfare state is the heavy bureaucracy. Now we have a heavy bureaucracy that is committed to the pursuit of profit, not to the redistributive social justice agenda of the welfare state, but, state intervention with the logic of predation. To push us all in the pursuit of profit. So the two worst features of liberal capitalism and welfare capitalism are combined now to create this massive pressure on everybody that I call massive precarity.
I'm not going to raise my voice against a resident of Brussels on the question of bureaucracy. We can take our position as being completely authoritative on that point.
So you mentioned that the welfare state is disappearing. I come from Czech Republic, and I lived in Britain for 7 years. And I don't see that. I mean, we still have in the Czech Republic free education, legacy of communism. We have healthcare. The social safety net is pretty strong, right? If someone is unemployed, they get support, financial support from the government. So how is that disappearing? Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so Eastern Europe is quite a different case, a very special case, because there has been a lot of heritage from communism that people have not completely agreed to give up. Also, Western Europe serves as a pool for labor. So there is not, in Eastern Europe, there is not much shortage of labor, actually. Exactly because this competition on wages creates a different dynamic there. But one of the most precarious strata at least in Western Europe, are the self-employed. It's not the workers, but the self-employed, because more and more people are pushed away from state employment into self-employment. For instance, plumbers, they're all self-employed. They don't have unemployment insurance. In most European countries, the self-employed don't have any security, job security. So this kind of social group is growing, and that is very worrying, because actually neither trade unions are trying to help, nor the state. So it is a growing army of such precarious self-employed people.
Also, I think it's fair to say that in Western Europe, in the wake of Thatcher in Britain and other forces running through the continent, that the privatization and deregulation were they became kind of a cult, and the selling off of public assets has really transformed Western European economies to a remarkable extent. I don't know that I've ever seen a comparison of that phenomenon with what was the case, for example, utilities and roads and so forth in the United States. My impression is that while this was the doctrine of the Reagan administration, the reality was that many of these entities were being held at the municipal level in the United States, and still are. So one has a kind of an odd mix. For example, the electricity in the urban areas of Texas is largely municipal, so public companies, but out over the whole state as a whole, it's a constructed private market, which has been proven to be very, very unstable, and which has a tendency, certainly a couple of years ago, fell apart completely under the stress of a snowstorm, which is something electrical systems should be designed not to do. But we didn't have the same degree of the mass selling off of public assets as possible, because they were not so embedded in the state as at the central level as they were in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about
let me just interject one thing, that all these, the destruction of the welfare state was the joint venture of left-wing and right-wing governments in Europe. Some of the biggest privatization took place under the socialists in the 80s and 90s in France. So that's what is the very curious thing, that there was such a strong alliance between the center left and the center right to push towards this privatization, labor market deregulation, and that was institutionalized in Europe under the European Union rules. That the competition became a mantra. Although Brussels is very much criticized for bureaucracy, but actually the ideology of the European Union, the economic ideology of the European Union, economic policy is a competition. There are very strict rules against state aid in order to ensure the so-called playing field among economic actors. So this kind of free market capitalist ideology is still the the consensus among the main political forces, a prevalent ideology, but there are interesting cracks nowadays. Maybe we'll talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a convergence. I don't really know how where one could say you've seen a left-wing government in Europe in modern times. That was what we thought was happening in France in 1981 when Mitterrand came in, and the left-wing inside that government disappeared after a year. And of course, the Labour Party in Britain became Blairite, and only briefly, not while it was in power, has departed briefly from that under Corbyn, but otherwise not. And one could go down the list. I had a lot of experience in Greece, and the reality was, although when George Papandreou and PASOK were elected in 2009, you came in 2010, I guess. They had ambitions that along the lines of George's father, Andreas. They were not able. They were quickly overturned and reversed and put under a memorandum of understanding, which forced them to adopt a neoliberal policy. When Syriza was elected in 2015, and then they staged a 5-month rebellion, but eventually were forced to capitulate, as happened in July of 2015. So you really have a very strict international enforcement of these doctrines in the European setting. Come back to the U.S. I mean, the one place where I have most experience as I go back to is staff member of the Banking Committee in the House of Representatives in the 1970s. The national staff director in the early 80s is with the deregulation of finance. And this is where you had the real transformation of let's say the governing heights of the American economy. From the 30s to the 70s, the dominant institution in the United States was the large industrial corporation. That's what my father wrote about. And that was an entity that was intrinsically stabilizing, or intended to be. It was a going concern. It had to deal with its unions on the one hand, with the government on the other, with consumer movements. It was part of a corporate system. From the 1970s onwards, the corporations were largely gutted. They were part of the victims, if you like, of the attack on labor in the 1980s, as it went through with the destruction of the industrial base. And what emerged, what dominant was the financial sector, and that sector was deregulated in the 1990s, and in the 2000s, the enforcement, the legal enforcement against financial frauds was basically gutted, with the result being the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So we are now living through the aftermath of that. So having said that, there's still quite a lot of social welfare institutions in the United States. Perhaps the more important point is that at what we used to call the commanding heights of the economy, we now have essentially the same sort of power center that existed in the 1920s. It's dominated by the financial sector, and the financial sector, of course, is entrenched in its in the governing institutions, entrenched in the Congress, for example, in a way which is really unrecognizable compared to the situation when I was a young staff member and leading members of the U.S. Congress with people like Wright Patman or Henry Royce, who had no allegiance, who had the responsibility for oversight of banking, or William Proxmire, but no allegiance to the banking sector. You would be hard pressed to find anybody like that in American government now. Elizabeth Warren may be the one exception.
So you mentioned deregulation of finance, or generally deregulation of markets, which is one of the three main characteristics of neoliberal capitalism, along with privatization and then globalization, and technology, I would say, the advance in technology, which then resulted in the great financial crisis, right, of 2008 and 2009. Do you think that we could have approached it differently? And if we did, we could have avoided this transition to precarity capitalism? And if so, how should we have approached it?
I'm very doubtful when people refer to the main culprit of the process as the financialization of the economy, because, of course, the deregulation of finance and allowing more foreign direct investment into faraway territories, with the shifting of employment, loss of employment, etc. That's one of the triggers. But this is part of the architecture of global economic integration on the principles of free market. So that is really the problem, not one of the tools through which that was achieved, the financialization, the deregulation of finance. Because what the idea at the time in the 80s was that if we engage in this free market global economic integration, that is, integrating national economies on the principle of free market. That is going to give us the resources to feed, the inclusive prosperity that the Western populations were accustomed to. That is the calculus that actually misfired, because maybe we won as consumers, but we lost sources of livelihood, jobs. And I wonder now, this idea about reviving the industrial sectors, as there is this idea now in Europe, very much in the US, there's the talk. To what extent that is going to help? So it kind of reindustrialization of our economies.
You mentioned loss of jobs. I mean, I think the unemployment rate is 3% in the US. So where is this being reflected?
Well, what's happening in the US, unemployment rate is certainly quite low, but so has the employment ratio of employment to population has fallen about 10 points over the last, say, 15 years. So a much smaller fraction of the population is working. Why is that? Well, a good part of that is because the population has gotten older and people can take early retirement under Social Security at 62. So many people have, and they simply don't want to go back to the job market. Secondly, many of those workers were in households with multiple earners. And so the actual cost of working at the wages that were available, it didn't leave them much. It wasn't a very profitable enterprise from the worker standpoint. You had commuting and you had childcare and you had the general stress. And they did it partly to support the living standard of the household, partly to because otherwise you're stuck out in the suburbs with the crabgrass and the kids and the dog, and the job is a source of social life in America. We don't live unfortunately in Prague or Brussels or other places where people congregate in cafes and so forth and generally enjoy themselves. We're spread out over the suburbs, and if you want to be doing something interesting, you need to have a job someplace. So there was that, but that calculus changes, and certainly with the pandemic, first of all with the crisis, and secondly with the pandemic, it changed quite a bit for a lot of people. So those are I think two major factors. And the unemployment rate is indeed low, but that does not mean that we are in the same kind of jobs boom that we had over the previous 20 years. But let me come back to this question of finance and industry. I'll just put it in more concrete material terms. If you're running an industrial economy, then the personnel that you need are people who are trained to certain particular disciplines and specialties. You need a whole set of engineers and managers and people who handle resources, people who do design of products, and these need to be quite stable over time. So this is the feature of a successful industrial economy, and it still exists in large parts of the world. I mean, it's still the major feature, let's say, of the Japanese or the Chinese or the Korean system, and the German, Central European to a certain degree, though it's under a lot of stress right now. But that's the social center of an industrial economy. A financially dominated economy is intrinsically unstable. The only thing you're doing here is trying to make money, and you're making money by playing with money and playing with market valuations, real estate, corporate stocks, whatever it might be, cryptocurrencies. It was sort of the ad absurdum of this particular system. The person who exploits volatility is the person who ends up on top in that system, and that is a system which is going to generate crisis after crisis after crisis. crisis. And I guess, I've now gotten to the point where I've seen a lot of this. My first crisis was New York City in 1975. And I tracked every single one of them going forward from that point through that crisis of the 1980s, on to the Great Crisis and the European crisis and the Greek manifestation. And I was in Portugal shortly after in the middle of the European crisis, and speaking to a meeting, I said that the Portuguese must be particularly proud of the acronym PIGS, which was being used to describe the countries in the crisis. I said I could reveal for the first time the secret of the real meaning of that acronym. The prime minister actually was in the audience, and everybody was still for a second. I said, "Principal instigator Goldman Sachs."
Wow.
And this got me a modest ovation from the crowd. But anyway, that's where we are, I think. But really, it's a mistake to run a major economy, leave a major economy in the hands of bankers who are working, or financial operators who are working for themselves. It's a formula for real trouble for everybody else.
So I just want to take over maybe with just 2 points that come to mind. So this, of course, in a global integrated capitalist economy, the profit motive, the pursuit of profit, the competition for profit is a driving factor, whether you have an industrial economy or financialized economy. But the short-term perspective of financial capitalism is what deepens precarity. Exactly what James stressed, that if you have an industrial economy, you think more of a long-term profit creation and material welfare, while financial capitalism really shortens that perspective. That is why we are so and destabilizes.
I think that's very, very, very clear. That what happened in the 80s and 90s was that the major corporations were driven by the takeover, essentially, of Wall Street and the financial analysts into a kind of short-term perspective. This was called shareholder value. It was a doctrine advanced by Milton Friedman and various acolytes of his, saying that the corporation's job was to maximize profit. Well, without saying over what time frame. So, but quarter to quarter is what it became. And so you ended up with the manipulation of their real assets, selling off, looting, laying off of key personnel in order to boost the share price, in order to, among other things, compensate the executives who had stock options. And this worked to debilitate the underlying strength of the industrial system. Where that didn't happen was in these economies which were kind of a blend of capitalist and socialist ethos, and notably China, where it's not to say there weren't speculative impulses in China. Try the real estate, but the industrial system runs on principles which I'm inclined to describe as Galbraithian. They're the principles that my father sort of laid out as characteristic of the American system of the 50s and 60s. And I think that's true in Korea. It's true, and it continues to be true largely in Japan. And it's not surprising that that's where the industrial weight center of gravity of the world has moved.
So we dealt with the great financial crisis through bailouts of these large financial institutions that became too big to fail, and huge austerity measures, cuts to social security, which led to this new stage of precarity capitalism. How else should we have dealt with it to avoid this stage?
I was there in 2008 at the Capitol the day before the vote on the first big bailout, the $700 billion troubled asset relief program. It was the vote that went down. The United States government had the authority to take over the banks, and should have used that authority. That's the essence of the matter.
So nationalized
the
banks.
Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, under a very capable administrator appointed by the Republican Sheila Bair, should have simply moved in and exercised that authority. The Treasury Department prevented them from doing it. And what the Treasury Department saw, or their position was that these banks were essentially, they see them as dominant institutions in the world economy, which are not entirely false, but they see that as being more important than having stable institutions in the for the national economy. That was true. That was true not only of Henry Paulson, who was not the worst actor in this business, but it was especially true of Timothy Geithner, who was running New York Fed at the time and moved on to be Treasury Secretary in the Obama administration in 2009. So this was a huge. It was a major failing of that at that particular moment, and I have to say once again that the one person who really had the sensible approach was in fact the Republican Sheila Bair.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened, in fact, is that by not nationalizing the banks, public authority absorb and by bailing them out, by giving them the money to reboot, they in fact public authority absorbed the risk and pushed the opportunities, the profits to the private sector. So I think that this is what deeply destabilized further. It's one of the sources of precarity, because you can have precarity, the way I describe it in my work, exists both on individual level. For instance, our sources of livelihood are insecure, but also on societal level, when the commons, including the financial system, is so fragile that we're all left to struggle on our own. So this is what the situation we have now as a result of the way the financial crisis was managed, that society absorbed the risk. There is no more, funds for social services, and private entities such as banks, they profited from them.
Well, let me point to another aspect of this, which I think is really crucial, which is that there was the American economy had a reputation in the second of the 20th century for a very high degree of integrity. That was part of the appeal of the American system. It was essentially it was considered to be a relatively uncorrupt society, and if you grew up in Eastern Europe at the time, that was certainly part of the American image. I think, as you could see, that the institutions of those countries were very heavily corrupted. So we've lost that, and we lost that by failing to insist on standards of integrity in the financial sector. And I can tell you when this transition occurred. It occurred roughly around 2000. In the 1990s, in the wake of the first major debacle, the savings and loan crisis, the federal government actually did engage in a very systematic cleanup. And senior people went to jail for long periods of time. Charles Keating, for example, Lincoln Savings and Loan, got a 20-year sentence. There were others that were almost as bad. 1,000 executives of that industry who were engaged in financial fraud ended up in federal prison. 1,000. This was under late Reagan and George H.W. Bush. So it was not something that was done by the Democrats. It was done by the professional regulators at the time.
We have the example of Bernie Madoff, right?
Great crisis with a much higher level of fraud. Nobody suffered those penalties. Nobody was effectively prosecuted, maybe one person. And that meant that the institutions, although a number of people, the senior people disgraced and left and so forth. There was turnover at the top. But the institutions operate on the same, let's see how we can bend the rules and how far we can go. And how far can we go? Well, Sam Bankman-Fried, look at it. Okay, he's being indicted, but I mean, really? That far? Where you have a cryptocurrency brokerage sitting in the Bahamas raiding its hedge fund to use to support its operations. It's really quite, and gets away with it for a long time.
He hasn't gotten away with it. I think his trial.
Well, at this point, yeah, but in fact, it was lionized until the thing collapsed. Even with Enron, there was an expose before it collapsed. So where did the turning call? 2001, essentially, what happened was that the regulatory agencies were gutted. The FBI, in particular, its financial task force, was gutted in order to reassign those agents to counterterrorism, which not unreasonable under the circumstances, but they were never replaced. And so you ended up in the 2000s with essentially free-for-all environment.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is a similar problem in Western Europe. Of course, we know how corrupt institutions in Eastern Europe are. Basically, it's a corpse. But in Western Europe, what I find is this fragility was rather created because the logic of profit seeking permeated completely governments. And I'd like to give this striking example. In 2018, the European Commission proposed that there is an investment in the early creation of vaccines against what? Against the coronavirus family, and the answer was no. They dropped the idea. Why? Because the institution within which that idea was generated was something called Innovative Medicine Initiative. So it's a private-public entity, the European Commission, plus Big Pharma. The idea was exactly to invest in the creation of cutting-edge means to protect society from big threats like the coronavirus pandemic. It was known that it's coming, and then Big Pharma said, "No, thanks. We don't want to put our money in this because this is not profitable." So I'm not so outraged at the answer of Big Pharma. I'm outraged at the answer of the European Commission, because that means to adopt that logic of commercial interest into decisions that concern society. So whether our institutions, even if we don't have this erosion of integrity in the European institutions, what I find alarming is the permeation of that commercial logic into decisions about public health, public education, etc.
There's a very basic principle at stake here, I think, which Albena is really alluding to, or circling around and pointing at, which is that in order for a complex system to function, the regulatory apparatus must exist, and it must have an independent, autonomous control. It cannot be under the direction of the entity being regulated. When you have a power plant, your cooling system operates under its own logic. It cannot be in the control of the reactor itself. And when you have a car, you must have oil in the crankcase, and you put that in. You don't take it out in order to let the car run hotter, because the thing will melt down. And the same is true of social institutions. If these things are jammed together, and you give the regulated entity control over the regulation, it's not going to work. It is going to blow apart. It's going to, first of all, serve the interest of the regulated entity, and it will fall apart at in any situation of stress. We see that again with banking. We see that, and we see that with the electrical grid in Texas. The situation Albena was just describing with pharmaceutical innovation. You can go down the list. You can just go down the list. You can see that, in fact, with the state of the military industries, which are control of the defense contractors. And good luck with the results. If you want to serve any particular public purpose, you're not going to succeed. If you want stability over time, you're not going to get it. That's the essence of it. You get to my age and you say, you take your blood pressure medicine on the recommendation of your doctor. You don't just rely on your system to regulate itself. It's not a good idea.
True. So we moved from sort of fair income and wealth inequality, where risks and opportunities were correlated, to unfair inequality, where the distribution of risks is not proportionate to the opportunities. And James, I read that you are leading the University of Texas Inequality Project, which has been described as a pioneering inequality measurement. Can you share some of the findings, and how would you go about measuring inequality?
I'm glad to hear that description. I hope it wasn't one of my own. But
it was a description by historian Lord Skidelsky.
Oh, how very nice. Well, I thank Robert for that.
It's on your Wikipedia.
No, this is the really big difference between Albena and myself, that she is a thinker and I am a counter. And what the Inequality Project set out to do was to try and bring some order and consistency to the massive evidence about what measures of inequality actually were, at lots of different levels, at the broadest level of the economy of the world. And what we discovered, to my surprise, and I have to say to my pleasure, was that the economics that I learned at the University of Cambridge in the 1970s from the original Cambridge Keynesians actually applied. You could find these large macroeconomic patterns driven by finance, driven by the great financial events of the age, in the measures of inequality across a whole spectrum of countries around the world. So the debt crisis of the 1980s is a huge turning point, driving up inequality for 20 years. In the 2000s, there's some stabilization for a while, and that's a consequence of the reduction of interest rates, the rise of China, the improvement of commodity prices, and these things, which are macro developments of the global scale, have a very powerful effect on inequality inside countries. And that's you would expect that, but finding the data that actually measure this gives you an understanding of what the big forces in the world economy actually are. That's I think the contribution that we've tried to make. It's taken a lot of work because the data had to be constructed largely from scratch, and by a small battalion of very dedicated students. For the most part, I didn't do it, but it's I'm quite proud of this work. I think it has lasting value both at the theoretical level and at the practical level of how one extracts inequality measures from very widely available data sets in ways that are really easy to implement. We did not have money. Yeah, it was a low cost endeavor. That a huge advantage.
So do you think that inequality should be the subject of our discussion these days? Or as
as I say, I'm the counter, and Albena is the thinker. I'm very interested in inequality, the relative levels, and so forth. But understanding what the numbers mean is another enterprise. Where we converge really is that the movement or the change of inequality over time is often a very good index of the degree of precarity in the society. So in some sense, having gotten the numbers, trying to figure out what they mean is where I really developed my enthusiasm for Albena's book and for her work generally, by making that connection in my head. Okay, this is articulating in a very effective way a lot of what is underpinned by, or underpins what we were observing.
Yeah, what I have, being not an economist, but thinking about the economy, what I have suggested is that we take the not only growing inequality, because it's clearly there. How does it go? 1% of the world, the rich of the world, own
50%.
Of the wealth.
Yeah, you've got to be careful with that one. I'm going to demur a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think the 1% own 50% of the stock market in America.
Oxfam trolls Davos every year with a press release to this effect, and I say, bless them. It's good, but the reality is most of the world has no financial assets. So if you have $1, you won't. Yeah. You're in the position of having more than half the world. So that
right. So these statistics they can mean many things.
It's polemical.
But surely, I mean, indisputably, growing inequalities there. Economists have argued, have spotted actually correlation between growing inequality in conflict, imprisonment, dropping levels of trust, mental health disorders. But they have, I find, very quickly concluded that the correlation is the causation. So that's one debate. What actually, and here is one very easy example I could give. Japan is often compared to the US. And say, well, the US has all these growing inequality. Japan is much more equal, and they have better levels of mental health, less conflict, etc. But what these statistics overlooks is that Japan also has a very robust healthcare system. It has a very robust employment system, almost guaranteed employment. So there are other factors that might interfere to give those outcomes. So I'm not very convinced that inequality is the causal factor. But that's another thing. What I find more interesting to look at is also the question of how come we are so disturbed by inequality? How come it is suddenly such an issue? Okay, apart from the statistical fact of growing inequality, why do we find it? We live in these liberal capitalist democracies that have always been unequal. And nobody in their right mind would say we need to live in absolutely equal, kind of proto-communist societies. But why are we so much disturbed? And my answer is that material inequality is being transformed into social inequality, and this is actually what bothers us. For instance, it means more political voice, that the rich have more political say. But then we are not going to solve that with redistribution. We have to look at what institutions are translating wealth into political voice. The fact that, for instance, you can buy basically in America, less in Europe, but campaign financing is such a institution that transforms wealth into political impact. And the other thing is, probably which is the most striking thing that I find, it should be more obvious than it is. We are so bothered about inequality because personal wealth matters more nowadays when the commons are depleted, when there is not sufficient investment in public health care, for instance. You rely more on your personal funds to secure yourself good health care. So exactly because the public services are so depleted of resources and of kind of institutional capacity to do their job, we rely more on personal income, and therefore personal income matters more. And then we start thinking of who has more. But you cannot provide good healthcare based on not for yourself, no matter how rich you are. Because for that you need, robust investments in education, in medical research, in hospitals capacity. So this is what strikes me most, that this fixation on numerical inequality turns attention away from the real problem. And the real problem is the precarization of our society, both individually and as society.
Well, I'm going to offer just a perspective that I think is somewhat complementary to that one. Maybe it's brings to light a different aspect of this. What we, I think, observe and establish that by and large, the rising inequality when it occurs, and particularly in a country like the United States, where you have good data on the very rich because they file tax returns, unlike in some other countries of the world, including advanced countries, where they put their money in tax havens and you never hear about it. In the U.S., you basically have a pretty good sense, and this is largely because of rising capital asset prices, stocks and real estate, and concentration of stock ownership in a handful of corporations which are held by their founders. That's where the really richest people are, and that's always been to some degree the case. But the society had institutions which kept its very wealthiest members under some degree of discipline and control, some degree of responsibility. It was not by any means complete, and it was always contested. But certainly in the 20th century, that was the purpose of the New Deal. It was the accomplishment of the New Deal, and it was deeply resented by the wealthy. But it meant, for example, when you had a strong and effective estate and gift tax, there's enormous incentive to as you got a little older with your hundreds of millions or billions to pass it off onto charitable institutions, universities, hospitals, churches, foundations, and that structure of institutions sort of reintegrates the very wealthiest people into the society. That's been breaking down for 30 or 40 years. And what you then have is a very different cultural relationship between the bulk of the population and the handful at the top, who, we can treat them as oligarchs. And that is a term which is well known in Eastern Europe, well known in Russia, well known in Ukraine and other places. These are people who work for themselves, and who are all about the consolidation of power in their own hands. And you can see this in the United States. You can see this very clearly now. And that is a situation which is going to create, over time, it necessarily creates a politically unstable society, one which is considered to be illegitimate and unacceptable. And that, you understand that if the entire federal government's working for a handful of billionaires, because that's where all their funding is coming from, funding of the politicians is coming from, and if they control the Justice Department and everything else, if that's the perception, then you're going to get, some oligarch, and in our case, Donald Trump, is going to have a lot of appeal for people who feel they've been completely shut out of the system. And that's a problem that we are not even close to confronting effectively.
So you're saying that these economic and social insecurities, like employment insecurity around safety, are leading to the rise in populism?
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm a great fan of the populists. The populists were a political movement of the late 19th century which was farmers and workers. They were strongly oriented toward toward an easier monetary policy. They were against the hard money men, but they were also very much in favor of education. They were actually in favor of trade. This was a very smart group of people. The term has been suborned and made into a pejorative term to describe what are essentially demagogues who have no popular basis, are not populists at all, because there's no popular foundation to what they do, except that they can appeal to a group of people who feel disaffected in a very inchoate way. Trump, for example, really didn't have a program. His program was an expression of anger, capitalized on it, got to the presidency. And at that point, his administration was captured one gang after another for various different purposes.
I mean, he used this fear that people had around globalization, employment insecurity, and turned it into xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiment, right? Which is not, again, it's a symptom, it's not the cause. So how do we shift their perspective to make them realize that xenophobia,
I think what you need, in fact, is an authentic populism. You need to have a broad-based movement. This is very hard to organize in a world which we don't have the industrial foundation that led to trade unions, who spearheaded this in the last century. But that's essentially the task. The idea that professional elites, such as Professor Azmanova and myself, are going to be the leaders of a popular movement. Well, I'm afraid we're not. We live in too comfortable circumstances, and the professional classes, of which we are a small part, and we are a rather idiosyncratic part of them, are complacent. They are self-absorbed, and they do not reflect the broader the interests of the people about whom Albena has been writing. And they simply don't do it, because they're the ones who experience the precarity that is being basically spreading throughout the larger population.
Yeah, just there I'm in agreement with James, and I even advise in my work not to use that label, populism. It's a misnomer, it's misleading, it's a lazy label. All these are mobilizations of anxiety that then demagogues are capturing and are shifting that social angst into the direction of the easy solutions, like shut down immigration, appoint an enemy. So rather than reform the economy and deal with the drivers of that precarity, of that insecurity. Another thing I wanted to point out is, James spoke about the alienation of the elites. Some of the biggest advocates of social justice in the good times of the welfare state were the upper middle classes. Actually, they shouldered a lot of the burden of taxation and redistribution, and this is the kind of solidarity that is disappearing. So the middle and the upper middle classes no longer care about the poor because they are so anxious about losing their own social status. So we know that the poor are politically not so active. So they need these champions of the middle and upper middle classes, and this is breaking down.
Well, I think actually I disagree, because in America, it's the upper middle classes that are mainly advocating for climate change. Like the children of wealthy parents, at least. In
climate change is not social justice. That's climate justice.
Climate justice.
Climate justice and social justice are very different issues. And the red and the green ideas are very often in a clash, because the workers are reasoning, we are going to lose our jobs because of green investment. So we cannot, that is what we need to resolve. And I'm proposing that because investment in green solutions, in climate justice, let's call it, would require such enormous mobilization of resources.
Yeah.
It might indeed cost jobs in the short term. It might aggravate the economic conditions of the poorest, who are dependent for their survival on those toxic, jobs in the polluting economies. So we cannot close our eyes for that. And in order to bring the two, the green idea and the the green and the red ideas, social justice and economic justice, we need to square that circle, honestly. We have to say, yes, it's going to cost something. And rather than affluence, we need to give people something. And what that something is economic stability. Our societies overall are very affluent. So if we provide stability, people might, agree to live with less.
There's also a question of the technical realism. I think it's fair to say that in the mobilization of what became called the Green New Deal in the United States, the objective was to gain the allegiance of activists by presenting a very ambitious agenda, which was not something that had an engineering basis to it. It was not something that was disconnected from the real world, and people can see that. And so they say, okay, what's going on here is the organization of a political movement by people who are not in a position really to implement a technically successful program. And so it becomes politically vulnerable, and will I think tend to alienate the people who quite rightly feel that they're going to be hit by things like taxes without getting any concrete benefit or sustainable benefit out of it. Something like it's also true with respect to the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes in France. They were hit with a tax on diesel, with the idea that they were somehow going to replace their tractors and their other equipment. These were rural people, often with farms, with something else, and that's not so easy to do. It was no easy alternative. So essentially, for them, became you're going to have a lower income and effectively maybe be out of business, and for what benefit exactly? At the end of the day, is this going to generate a new economy coming out of that? If so, that's very far down the road. So they had I think a very reasonable beef with a program that was written essentially. I mean, it's certainly sold to a large extent by economists on the basis of ideas about how easy it is to substitute one thing for another, when it in fact is not easy at all to do that. You have to lay down vast investments in advance in order to make that both technically possible, if it is technically possible.
But wouldn't the market take care of that?
No, the market definitely does not take care of it. Someone has to make a decision to engage in a vast amount of fixed investment based upon a certain future. And they have to judge the technical possibility of what they're doing, and they have to have the material competence. And that's a problem in the United States, maybe a problem also in Europe, that the engineering skills, the planning skills have atrophied as we've become, an economy dominated on the one hand by finance, on the other hand by, let's say, software engineers. Maybe there's a fair energy industry there, the fossil fuel industry is still there, but in terms of being able to do the kinds of things that were basically U.S. led industries in the last century, aerospace, atomic energy, and so forth, that's not coming out of this country at this point.
I think climate tech in the U.S. is at record highs. A lot of venture capital funds are focusing on climate-related startups that are trying to solve climate change. They're making it cheaper to
Yeah, there are certainly a lot. I mean, again, a lot of let's say action in the financial markets in this. But the fact about startups is that they sell a product to investors. Are the investors competent
They sell
to judge
products
whether,
to customers.
well, not initially. They have to raise the funds.
Yeah.
And we shall see whether they are capable of doing at scale what they promise to do. We have lots of experience with waves of startups that crashed to earth pretty shortly thereafter. So we don't know that, but what I do know is that moving into a particular technical area, you need to have lots of people who know that area very well, and I don't think we do. We have people who can sell products to venture capitalists. Those skills are, those are taught in business schools and celebrated in the media. That's not the same thing as being able to, let's say, organize a Manhattan Project, for example, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, or you name the major development projects of the last century. That's not what we're seeing. Those were not done by floating initial public offerings or funds, raising money from private equity or hedge funds.
So are you saying we should incentivize education, engineering education, so that we raise a new generation of people that will be able to solve climate change through technology?
If indeed it's possible, that's where you have to start, and we're several generations behind in that process. The engineers are obviously in much greater numbers in China, Russian Federation for that matter, elsewhere. That's where engineering education has been sustained. It has not been sustained. We have been, in the United States, we've been importing engineers for quite a long time.
Let me just extend that a little further. See, all the technological the major technological innovations during the Cold War were done by the governments, both of by the Pentagon, by the governments of the East and the West. Now we have outsourced all that to markets, but consult even one of the greatest adepts of capitalism, Joseph Schumpeter. He would tell you that in capitalism, that private enterprise cannot absorb the greater risk that is associated with innovation. Innovation, the risk of innovation, of this kind of innovation, that massive amount of money we need now to be invested in green technology, can only be taken by a public authority. You cannot leave it to this taste of private business for risk only to the extent that it brings in profit. So we are at a point of history where we need massive investment, and only the state can absorb that can manage that kind of job.
That's really anti-Schumpeter, the position you're taking. Schumpeter was all about the contestants in a lottery for big prizes. I thought that was. I
can get you. I will find that quote, send it to you. I was really shocked reading it.
I have a recollection of talking to my father very late in his life. And I think he might have been even in the hospital in his last days. And he said to me, he knew Schumpeter. He said, Schumpeter was a fraud. So, what do you mean? He was also he said he would say things that he didn't believe just for the effect. Dad said, I went to his seminar once or twice and I got that impression and stopped going.
No, what saved Schumpeter?
I actually copied that remark down in the flyleaf of a book I was reading at the time.
Well, Schumpeter was also a good Marxist. That idea about creative destruction came from Marx. Yeah.
Albena, on your point of innovation, I think that the private markets can absorb a lot of risks. Like if you look at Apple, Microsoft, Oracle, all these companies that have pioneered, new technologies, they're all private companies. So where is the innovation from public companies coming from, or the government funded projects?
So you're saying that the big economic players, yeah, these are big economic players, but there are a handful of them, and they would not invest where profit jeopardizes their where risk jeopardizes their profit. These are the companies that really reap the benefits of economies of scale because they can reach to many consumers. They're great, important players. Of course, they can absorb a lot of risk, but their logic is profit extraction. So we cannot expect miracles from them to go against their very logic.
Let me just give a gloss on that a little bit. I think in order to have really major investments on a big scale, whether it's public or in some cases private, but mostly public, you need to have a long time horizon. You need to have the view that the project's going to generate a return over an extended period of time. In the kind of economies in which we presently have, which we have evolved, which are finance dominated, this is not the case. We have crises every decade or so, and maybe even more frequently than that. And that is a huge deterrent against large-scale fixed investment. You need to have something that's overriding the private incentive, which is to try and make money quickly, because you don't know. You hold on you go do something for 10 years, chances are something bad's going to happen and it's going to be unprofitable.
But
if you
venture
do
capital
for 3
funds,
years, you have a better chance. What?
Venture capital funds are investing for longer periods, for 10 years, sometimes even more.
And the scale in which things are required, you don't see the major infrastructure. I mean, even right now in the U.S., we're talking about, for example, electric power charging stations for electric cars. That's got to be a public endeavor. It's not going to happen. The private sector is not going to put in that infrastructure, I don't think, on the scale that's required. And I think that in fact is what to give them a certain amount of credit. The Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, has that funding in it. That's the point of it, is to try and do something that the private sector is not going to do. The private sector isn't going to do it because their time horizons have been shortened dramatically.
When it comes to the process of politicization of issues, where politicians decide what topics deserve public attention and policy action, why have we, or the public as well, why have we moved away from the hardcore economy issues, taxes, to social justice, climate justice? How did that transition happen, and why is that? Why are we so preoccupied with social justice issues in America, and is that a problem?
Well, our politics are guided by with a set of funding interests, essentially, and so the discussion in particular of the tax structure has been largely off the table since the early 1990s. There's just has not been it doesn't you don't have the same priority to it. So the consensus is locked in place on those questions, and the questions that attention is directed to are, they insulate certain interests. The same be true of financial regulation. There was a brief period following the financial crisis when some additional regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for example, where it was put in place. But I don't know that anybody who's close to that industry thinks that that the situation is stable or adequate now. So it's a money talks proposition. I'll give just a little example of this. I worked for the Banking Committee in the House of Representatives in the 70s. There were about 30 members on that committee, and there were 2 rows of desks for members and quite a lot of space in the hearing room for the public. Now there are 4 rows of desks and there's very little space. Why are there 64, I think, members of that committee? The answer is it's a funding mechanism. And the leadership of parties puts members on that committee in order to attract funds from the banking lobbies. Well, I mean, those members may be very liberal or very conservative on all of these other issues, social issues, for example. The banks don't care. So long as they have their lines to these members, and the members, so long as they are in line with what the banking lobbies want, they're perfectly at liberty to do anything else that they like. But that just ensures that the banking committee is not going to be a source of real oversight of the banking sector, just for example, the banking regulators. And that's where you can understand why certain functions of government break down. That's in those circumstances. It's sad for me because I really loved that committee. It was better than graduate school as an education in real politics, and had some very interesting and distinguished people on it. But now it's the people I know are portraits on the walls. People I knew.
Lucia, I take your question about politicization. Very interesting. So you're saying there is some sort of a shift. I would rather say this shift is from the economic and social justice, for a bit at least. There was a shift towards culture wars. So the wars about based on or disagreements about religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, and so forth. Maybe this is what you had in mind, and this is more felt in the U.S. than in Europe. But sure, there is an intensification of conflicts around those, not social and economic justice, but rather cultural justice, the justice of recognition of minorities. And maybe I suspect actually the precarity has something to do with that, because in a society where the social safety is thinning out, minorities' final hope for some sort of protection is to claim victimhood, the victim status, because then they can, claim some sort of a, special treatment. So I would say that economic precarity is intensifying the culture wars as minorities are fighting for victimhood.
Well, that's a very fair observation, yes.
You're also saying that in your book that the left-right divide has been erased, and that the right has moved to the left on cultural identity and the left to the right on economic issues. I think that's not quite accurate, at least in the US. The left is moving more towards socialism, collective ownership, regulation of the market, and the right is moving more towards, xenophobia and racism. And so why do you think that the divide has been erased? Where do you see that?
Well, for quite a bit of time, at least since the 80s, 90s, and the past 20 years, there has been this agreement between the center left and the center right on the mantra of free market economics, free market capitalism. So in that sense, there was not a serious opposition to this idea on the left, or this new liberal turn of the left. Now, some of those ideas are coming back. Let's see. It's too early to conclude, but more or less the economic. What I mean to suggest is that for many people, the left-right orientation does no longer help them navigate politics. If there is such an agreement that capitalism is without an alternative, and as I said, socialism is reviving its appeal among some of the young, but it lost a lot of its appeal because of the experimentations in Eastern Europe, the failed experiments in Eastern Europe. So as capitalism doesn't have a plausible alternative among many publics, that socialism versus capitalism dichotomy doesn't mean much for the common people. There's academic and intellectual debates, but when it comes to politics, it doesn't help people navigate the political space. It's more meaningful divide would be whether I experience this formula of open markets, digitalization of the economy, etc., as a threat to my survival, to my well-being, or as an opportunity. And that opportunity-risk divide is simply more meaningful in the way people make sense of politics. This is what I'm suggesting. And politics has been adjusting to that, yeah.
Yeah, to your observation, Lizzie, about the direction of politics, and particularly of the left, such as it is in the United States. I would say that in 2016, with the emergence of Bernie Sanders as a serious challenge to Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination, well, that was an interesting moment in which there was a clear-cut left, traditional left, if you like. I mean, Sanders is a very traditional figure. New Deal left position with a limited number of economic planks in that platform. And by 2020, it was the focus on these questions was largely lost. As Sanders tried to broaden himself out to be almost anything for anybody who was in the progressive camp, and as a result of that, his base, to the extent that it was preserved at all, shifted in a way which made it very fragile. I mean, fundamentally, the working class element that was attracted to them in 2016 was not attracted to him so much in 2020 and went for Biden. And then the South and the African American community in the South shifted decisively to Biden, and that was the ballgame. So I think the moment that 2016 moment is now quite far in the past. What did happen in the interim, particularly in 2020 in the pandemic, was an immense sort of coalescence around the idea that the government could spend money. It's not about major reforms, and there were no major reforms in 2020. There wasn't national health insurance. You might think, well, that's what you could do. There wasn't Mike Lind and I proposed a Reconstruction Finance Corporation style health finance corporation to take care of material issues that were emerging. All kinds of things of that nature didn't happen. What did happen was money piled out to companies and to individuals' households through every conceivable channel. And everybody realized that worked just fine. That held the society together. It prevented a major social calamity. It actually reduced poverty in important ways, but it didn't give you any basis of a coherent movement going forward. And what we're seeing in the Biden administration, well, is an outgrowth of that, or at least what we saw in the early phases, and a certain number of investments in certain areas. But my sense is that also is now substantially exhausted. That we don't have nobody's proposing another $2 billion program. They don't think that's viable. And so it's really hard to see where, in a kind of economic policy sense, American politics is heading. And I think that's why you've got the cacophony of other issues that are increasingly prevalent. There isn't anybody to replace Bernie Sanders as the Bernie Sanders of 2016 has a powerful voice for that kind of basic economic and institutional reform that I'm aware of.
Albena, so you're suggesting that the solution to precarity capitalism is subverting it from within, not overthrowing it, not reforming it, not stabilizing it. Can you tell us what that means? How do we fix political, economic systems from within without reforming it or overthrowing the system altogether?
Look, I'm not against overthrowing. I just want to be very realistic. There is no revolution in the offing. There is no powerful utopia to pull us out. So this project is simply a no-go. But to the extent that we have identified one of the drivers of this massive precaritization, I mean, it's not just a working class problem anymore. It's a massive problem. So I'm simply saying that any policy that strikes at this competitive pursuit of profit that permeates all political thinking nowadays would be a step in the right direction. And this is what we have to screen our policy for. Is redistribution actually getting us in that direction? Is worker the participation on company boards getting us there? For instance, this is one of the most sexy ideas on the left, worker control of companies. That's an old socialist idea that I think it's not so it doesn't have that much potential nowadays, because even if companies become in the hands of their workers, but still have to play the same game of competitive pursuit of profit in the global economy, they would behave like capitalists, with self-exploitation and pollution of the environment, destruction of the environment. So we need to keep an eye on the target, competition for profit, and oppose that. And there are many ways to fight this.
I mean, you suggest
it doesn't sound very radical. But what I'm saying is that in this particular context we find ourselves now, in this historical juncture, this is where our efforts should go.
One of the solutions you suggest is global economic integration on standards of employment, remuneration, consumer and environmental protection. And one of these would be the Paris Climate Accord, which did not work out as planned. So how can we get this done? Even if the United States and EU agree on something, China and India will definitely not. And therefore, US and EU will not risk being outcompeted by them.
Well, I would argue that
the European Green
a lot of the leadership on climate is in fact coming from China. In terms of technical development and in terms of moving toward some decarbonization, and the reason for that is that China is hugely vulnerable. The Chinese lowlands are deeply vulnerable to rising sea levels, and the Chinese water supply is deeply vulnerable to the shrinking of the ice caps in the Himalayas. So it's very much that, and they have a certain long-term planning perspective on this question. So whether they will be effective is another matter, but it's not as though they're unconscious. They were well ahead of the United States in terms of taking some serious initiatives in this area. But in terms of a global effort, I mean, politically, the world is breaking apart right now. And it seems to me we're well past the point where anything is going to happen on a global basis. A much more likely thing, I mean, I hate to be grim about this, is that particularly in Europe, with the cost and disappearance of or shrinking of natural gas supplies, which are at least half as carbon intensive, the Europeans will be forced to revert to coal. I think that's already happening, and that's so we're going to see significant costs from a climate standpoint of the current world situation, for sure.
Yeah, there is a fascinating, I mean, it's a tragic discrepancy between the blueprints and the agreements, the political decisions, the European Green Deal, it's so wonderful. They have figured out exactly how to square social justice, environmental justice, new jobs, the circular economy, and then actually the policy action goes so much against that. We're back to coal, indeed, because short-term considerations are trumping these long-term commitments. So everybody knows what needs to be done, and nobody is ready to actually do it. So my idea that we cannot solve these things on the level of national governments. We need cooperation. We need cooperation. So this withdrawal from globalization is not the way to go. It's not realistic even, because we have these production chains that are spreading around the world. You cannot repatriate all productions home. But we need to raise the economic and social standards, labor standards. And regrettably, the competition, even among the two main players that could push all the global economy in that direction, the US and Europe, there's more competition rather than cooperation among them. So that would be the responsibility of political elites to ensure that cooperation rather than competition, because that means it's race to the bottom.
Nobody is speaking right now for the interests of Europe and the world, not any side of it, including Europe's own leadership, is very clearly not doing that.
How is that?
Well, I mean, the European sources of resources have moved from being relatively stable and cost effective, preserving of the competitiveness of European industry, particularly German industry, to being reliant on heavily on imports, transatlantic imports in Asia. Mm-hmm. And good luck with managing the cost of that with the resulting consequences for the final products in world markets. You can already see this in the reduction of automobile production and exports in Germany, which has now fallen to, I think, third in the world leagues after Japan and China. So after having been the dominant exporter for a long time. So the situation is really getting to become, I think, quite serious. Another point on the whole problem of globalization and deglobalization, crucial industries, and semiconductors is the one that comes to mind, I think only function at the global level. The materials come from everywhere, including, for example, neon comes from Russia, is refined in Ukraine, just to take a nice example, but there are many, many others. The production chains are spread around the world. Half the market is in China. Dominant designs are in the US, but also the Netherlands. But if the Chinese market is to go away, as the US government itself said a couple of years ago, then the US firms will not have funds to continue their very rapid investments required to stay at the leadership. So deglobalization almost necessarily will mean the breakup and the collapse of certain key industries. And I'll offer a parallel, which is the breakup of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Comecon. What happened there, and similarly in Yugoslavia actually, was that industries which spanned the newly created borders between Russia and Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet space, simply fell apart. They could not operate. They could not operate as privatized industries and as transnational industries. And we could see something quite similar. We should really study that episode, because we could see something quite similar happening to the globalized economy that emerged in the following 3 years, and that we may be at the cusp of such a thing right now. That's going to put a lot of other concerns about how we might improve society very much in the background if these things develop along those lines, as we could be seeing some very serious basic consequences for the kinds of industries that we have in fact developed.
Right. Just to continue that thought, I mean, Biden's push, it's a very clever idea to poach European, talent with the green investment. But the weakening of Europe, I do not see it in the long-term interest of anybody. So that is one of the.
Why do you think, Albena, that anybody's acting in the long-term interests?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's just the issue here.
That goes against my own analysis.
Yeah, we have people. No. I mean, I think the governments on both sides have very short-term interests, very personal interests. Yeah. And they do not have an understanding of this is partly the fault of economics education, which has simplified everything down to the dumbest possible level. The markets will resolve things in a short period of time, and they don't really understand that they don't really need to have people who have an understanding of the engineering basis of economic systems, of the scientific basis, of the material basis, and those people are nowhere to be found in the West. That's not where our governments come from. We build our governments out of lawyers, people with economics degrees, and then marketing people and various self-promoters, and the result is, people who are simply quite illiterate about the consequences of current developments. They don't know, or perhaps they don't care.
And staking their political capital on short-term, delivery.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I was reading a critique, actually, this morning by a professor of philosophy of the Basque Country about the views of economists in Russia, and he makes a reference to Russia's leading economists and mathematicians. And I said, interesting. Here's a country with leading mathematicians. There is no country in the West that would recognize such a concept.
No such a thing.
But a country with leading mathematicians has some advantages over a country that doesn't have any.
I agree on that front. We have to invest more in education of sciences.
It's not just we have these people. They exist all through the West. They're nicely, comfortably ensconced in universities. My colleagues here in Texas, they're excellent physicists and mathematicians. Their political influence, though, is zero. They're completely disconnected from the ruling of the society. That's the problem. People come to the United States still all the time to take university. They're very good appointments. They're great for academic life, but there's simply no integration with the public space. And I did work in China in the 1990s. That was a government of engineers. There's no question about it. They were in close contact with their scientific community. Outside of a little bit in the defense sector, and I have some familiarity with that in the U.S. No, it doesn't happen here. Very, very little.
So we need to incentivize smart people, engineers, to go into politics. How do we do that? Do we increase the salaries of politicians?
No, that won't do it. You can easily pay politicians as much as you like. It will simply attract people who want money. That's the problem to begin with.
So how do we? My question is, how do we do that?
We've made it. It's not the political career that pays. It's what you do afterwards when you go off to a law firm or to a Wall Street entity, and they pay you, or to a lobbying firm, and they pay you very nicely. That is the rot in the system. Absolutely. But the stable institutions, national academies, for example, they used to be influential even in the United States. In fact, until very recently, the science advisor was an important figure for a long time in the United States. That was just one person, but still, this sense that there is a need to have technical people who are technically competent and wide-ranging I think is much, much less than it was 40, 50 years ago. And that is, that's the garden path that we have tread down. And it's obviously very clearly true in most of the governments of Europe as well. The professional politician, the lawyer turned politician, the investment banker turned politician, they don't need to know anything, and often they don't.
One of the other solutions, sorry, go on.
Do I have solutions? I wish I did. I mean, I don't have to say that. I'll turn to Albena solutions. I count it.
No, our job as academics is to give the diagnosis. I mean, it's interesting how we always end up being asked about solutions. So it would be what institutional mechanisms we could imagine that would shift the governing mind from partisanship to expertise, because this is what we want to see, long-term serious expertise rather than short-term partisanship squabbles. I would say more accountability. Clearly the institution of electoral accountability doesn't cut it anymore, because actually it becomes part of the problem when you have these short, 3, 4, or 5 years electoral cycles with politicians who only, want to score short-term victories. So we need to think more about, additional mechanisms of accountability in order to uphold this longer view of societal interest, the perspective. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, what kind of additional checks we can.
Yeah.
This is something I'm currently researching. I'm not sure. It needs some historical research as well, because
the answer is clear that neither Professor Azmanova nor myself really. I certainly struggle to understand and articulate the problem. That's the first task. And this was true. I mean, I said this many times in 2015 when I was working alongside Yanis Varoufakis in Greece. The most fundamental problem is getting the ideas straight out one's understanding. If you're caught up in a set of ideological formulas that seem adequate to you, and that's the contribution of my fellow economists, is that they've created that atmosphere that really protects you from having to know things. Then that's the bubble you first of all have to break out of. And at that point, an economist like myself should get off stage and let people who do have the ability to speak competently and clearly on the larger questions, on the material questions, have some airtime, because the fact is there's been a kind of, I knew this when I got my degree, is that an economics degree was kind of a privileged way to get into the public policy discussion space. It did not mean that you knew things.
Who knows things these days? Who knows things?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's right. So I got my degree in order to gain that access. I've spent the 40 or 50 years since then trying to learn things that make it useful to say something. But I don't, I'm under the illusion that that degree itself conveyed a particular set of formulas.
Yeah, I very much. I'm happy, James, you put it that way. Our job is to steer, if we can manage, to steer away from trite or set ready available ideological formulas. And actually, this is what I try to do in this book, by questioning the fixation on inequality, by steering away from the old socialist solutions to capitalism. So yeah, this is our job. To do thinking without, the crutch of ideology. Yeah.
That, to my mind, was the great contribution, and what I immediately saw. It attracted me to that book when I first read it. Was okay. Here is a clear expression of some of the core social questions that we face. There are not many of those around.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, what I liked about your book, Albena, is that, as you said, you don't think there should be an ideology, a theoretical ideology of whatever post-capitalism looks like, that we should just look at it as we go and implement flexible solutions that will work for the situation. Cool. Well, thank you both for this great discussion. It was my pleasure. And
certainly mine too.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much.
for making this